Hi, hello, welcome back. My name's Devraj, and I'm back with the Zohar this week. This is the second in my presentations about the Zohar. A little bit ad hoc they are, and we're just going to be continuing along from where we left off in the text last time, right at the beginning of the introduction of the Zohar, about the second, I think, kind of teaching block that's in there. And there's some really, really deep stuff in this text. And I think it's interesting and relevant to anyone who's authentically interested in spirituality and in mysticism. Before I get back into the text, I want to quickly recap a couple of the concepts from last week because I think they're super relevant generally and super relevant to this week's passage as well. And the first is the pardes, and the idea that the four consonants of this word, which in Hebrew just means garden or sometimes orchard, they refer to a level of meaning, that there are four levels of meaning for any mystical text. The most surface meaning is the literal meaning. Then underneath that, we have the kind of allegorical meaning, teaching concepts, spiritual concepts, that you get from it. Then you have injunctions about how to live. How should you be as a moral person according to the text, and how should you function in society? Legal interpretation as well. And then finally, there's the mystical level, the real mystical level. And if you've been watching my videos so far, then I tend to bang on a little bit about slightly negging on this second layer, but I do that really with the intention to try and stop people getting too caught up in the in the simple kind of the simple teaching concepts that these texts bring out. For example, the tree of life. If you go onto a Western or Jewish discussion group, on social media, you will often find just heaps and heaps of people talking about the concepts and all sorts of different models of the tree of life and what the Sephira relate to. And this stuff is okay, but it's good to understand that when you're doing a lot of this, when you're learning the text, when you're learning the mystical concepts and learning how to live properly, that's a waiting room. That's a waiting room to go on the real descent, because this journey was often called a descent back in the old days, even before the Zohar. And just to illustrate this a little bit, there's this very exciting story from traditional Jewish mysticism about the Pardes and about four rabbis. Basically, four rabbis, they decide they want to get to the deepest layer. They want to get to the deepest layer, the mystical layer. They want to go and hang out with Yahweh a bit, with God a bit, basically. And so what they do, they've obviously prepared themselves. They know all the teaching concepts, the spiritual concepts. They know the Torah. They know the words or whichever text they're referring to. You can use this concept to refer to any of the kind of mystical texts, whether Eastern, Western, whatever. And they're living right. They're living in the right way. And then what happens, they go on this journey to the mystical layer, and one dies, one goes mad, one becomes a heretic, renounces God, and the other comes out in peace. I think that was Rabbi Akiva who came out in peace. I don't remember the other guys' names. Dr. Justin Sledge over on the Esoterica channel has some interesting presentations about all this, just as an aside. But this is saying, it's like this descent into the mystical layer is not to be taken lightly. If you get involved in authentic mysticism, it's not just about a load of nice pictures of the tree of life. This is about dissolving your sense of self. It's about confronting aspects of your being that you've been repressing. It's about dealing with a lot of energy that's coming up into your system, a lot of emotion that's coming up into your system. If your nervous system is a certain way, it could spin you out and drive you a bit crazy. You might come to see things about the nature of the universe deep inside that you're not really prepared for, that could drive you a bit crazy again, or could cause you to completely abandon any belief in God. Whether it would actually kill you, I don't know if it would really do that unless you did something mad because of what you saw. But nevertheless, it's good to be aware that this descent into a mystical realm is not for the faint-hearted or the unprepared. It's not a little spiritual game. It's a really deep inner journey, and I think we can really thank traditional Jewish mysticism for making this clear. Okay, so that's the Pardes, which we looked at a little bit last week. I've expanded a little bit more here, hopefully in a helpful manner. And the second concept I touched on was the idea of a ladder, which we came across this idea of traveling rung by rung in the text before. And in fact, this ladder concept, we could say Jacob's ladder is a well-known ladder. And here's a nice little picture of Jacob's ladder. We've got Jacob down here. This is from Genesis, I think, first book of the Bible. And Genesis is having a little nap. He's obviously been working. Maybe he's been not sure what he used to do. Jacob, maybe he was herding goats or some similar kind of Genesis type occupation, but he's having a little nap. He's outside. And then he dreams that he sees this ladder going up to heaven with these angels going up and angels going down and this kind of thing. Now, this is on a mystical level, on the deeper level, this is a metaphor for an inner ladder. And this inner ladder, important to note, it doesn't go up, it doesn't go down. It's going inside, basically. On the front of this ladder, like the bottom rung here, down here, is like your intellectual self, this hardened group of concepts. It's like, if you've seen my presentations on Liber Al, quite different text, you have this concept of the whole world, Nuit, and then Hadit, this point of awareness that experiences the whole world. And then around this point of awareness slowly accumulates all these notions of limited selfhood, who I am as a personal being. And so this hardened intellectual self is on the bottom of this ladder here. It's at the front, basically. But as we travel, as we'll see when we go back into the text in a moment, using the word who internally, we slowly start to travel back down this ladder into more mystical levels. And it's important, I think, not to make it a ladder up or down, even though, of course, normally ladders are used for that purpose. So that's Jacob's ladder. Now I think we're ready to jump back into the text. This text is just from the introduction to the Zohar, and it's an introduction written by the writer of the Zohar. It's not a kind of some worthy academic saying how wonderful it is. It's the writer just giving you an introduction, but it jumps straight in, so to speak. It jumps straight in. So we looked last week, Rabbi Elazar opened, lift your eyes on high and see who created these. And, this idea that asking the question who, as in who am I, can take you on a deep inner search. Ramana Maharshi we mentioned, Charles Berner we mentioned, two mystical types who worked with self-inquiry, investigating the who. And that's what this text is talking about. And it's saying, if you keep looking deep enough, you'll travel back down these rungs mentioned here. Once a human being questions and searches, contemplating and knowing rung after rung to the very last rung. So it's talking about going on these rungs back inside yourself, diffusing your sense of self. And of course, you can still come back to the front if you need to and go back to this kind of hardened intellectual self. But you're diffusing that as well. You're having an awakening, perhaps, a breakthrough. So you're traveling back using the question who. And if you go back far enough, you come to the Ancient of Days. And this is, it's saying it's susceptible to questioning, means that you can move backwards and you will get there, It's a kind of subtle or comic way of saying it's susceptible to questioning. And we also looked, the idea of heaven above and heaven below. I'll pick that up again in another little episode, because that also, you can map that onto the tree of life. If you really like your tree of life, you can map that onto that. But where we got to last time, once a human being questions and searches, what? So what it's talking about, the limit of heaven above, you can discover that by asking the question who internally. And then as you do that, and as you move back rung by rung towards the last rung, now the question what becomes useful. What do you know? What have you contemplated? For what have you searched? And it says all is concealed as before. So in a sense, before we start this journey, before we start getting involved in this self-inquiry process, the word what is very simple to answer. What is around me? The plant out there and my little clock and my light, perfectly mundane, very, very easy to answer. But as I travel back and get back towards the Ancient of Days, this ancient one susceptible to question, then the word what becomes mysterious. I don't really know what this world is. When I dissolve myself and come off the front of the ladder, the bottom of the ladder, and go back, then the life becomes a mystery, it's saying. And this is a concept that will be picked up again in other parts of the Zohar, coming to a place where the whole world is like, it's a state of awe that you find yourself in, a state of wonder. as you defragment, so to speak, your sense of personal selfhood. And now let's continue on. Concerning this mystery, it is written, what can I take as a witness to you? What can I compare to you? Lamentations 2:13. When the holy temple was destroyed, a voice cried out, what can I take as a witness to you? What can I compare to you? So this is interesting, this little sentence. This is interesting to me. When the holy temple was destroyed, a voice cried out. So the holy temple, it's talking about, the original temple of Jerusalem, which was destroyed in maybe 560 BC, something like that. But it's talking about that as an analogy. And what it's really talking about is the book of Genesis and the idea of the fall. In the book of Genesis, you've got Adam and Eve, and they're in the Garden of Eden. And then the serpent has told them, don't eat or said to Eve, they blame Eve, of course, in this text, or that's one way it can be interpreted. And Eve, suggests, let's eat the apple of the fruit, which is the fruit of the tree of knowledge and good and evil. And this causes the fall to happen, this descent. So in psychological terms, what's going on, or mystical psychological terms, what this is really saying, because the allegory of Adam and Eve is written for the fallen God. If you're very Jewish hardcore, you might find this a bit triggering, but I do apologize, but this is the way I see it. But essentially, really behind the analogy is the idea that the God is existing in this perfect state. And as individual human beings, we didn't have before the fall a limited sense of self, a limited sense of being. We were simply like the kind of avatars of God. So we're just experiencing the world as this amazing, amazing thing. And then when we bit into the fruit of the tree of good and evil, then we basically became these limited beings. So God, he kind of gave the avatars their freedom with this act of the fall. And as he did this, as this happened, so God himself kind of, and I say himself, I apologize because obviously it's not a him, it's just the way I was brought up and you've got to express it somehow. So I don't want to over-focus on that. So God, as he descended, he basically became a billion little people. He became a billion little people, not the people so much themselves, yes, in a sense, but it's not really relevant, but rather the sense of self. Instead of one sense of self, of being this vast oceanic being, he became a billion little selves, individual identities. So the avatars of God developed like their own little personalities and their own, limited sense of being. And so essentially what's happening here, a voice cried out, what can I take as a witness to you? This is like the lament, basically, of God as he realizes this descent is going to happen. As he realizes that he is going to descend and break up into a billion, or nowadays 8 billion, tiny little beings, each with their own limited sense of self. So this God, as he's seeing that he's going to descend and be lost from himself and become these billion other little beings, he's saying, what can I take as a witness to you? What can I compare to you? What can I give myself as a tiny little being, one of just 8 billion beings, to understand what I was before? And now we're going to continue. I take what as a witness to you? So it's like saying, when you do this journey of who inside, then what becomes a witness to you. The word what you see around you, the great mystery becomes a witness to you. And it continues, every single day I have called witnesses against you since days of old, as is written. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. So I call heaven and earth to witness against you. I think what it's saying is, this kind of souvenir or memory, this useful kind of souvenir that I can drop into you is the concept of heaven. So you have this God in this kind of about to, he's witnessing that he's about to fall. And he's like, okay, what can I give myself when I've been broken up into 8 billion tiny little beings, all of whom believe themselves to be individual, to remind them. And that is this concept of heaven. So this about to fall God is giving us this concept of heaven as a reminder of who we are within a framework that we can understand, a simple dualistic framework. The idea that right now we're on earth, but, ideally we should be back in heaven. I compare you to what precisely? I crowned you with holy crowns, gave you dominion over the world, as is written. Is this the city that was called perfect crown of beauty, joy of all the earth? I called you Jerusalem built up, a city bound together. Now what can I liken to you to console you? Just as you sit desolate, so it is above, as it were. So this is again very super interesting, as it were. He's given us this concept of heaven. You're on earth, but there's a heaven up here that you want to aim towards. And he's saying, just as you sit desolate, so it is above, as it were. So, he's saying then also he's saying, even though he's basically fallen, he's creating the idea of a God still living up here in a different realm. So he's creating the concept of heaven and that a God is dwelling in this heaven. And he's saying, as it were, just to kind of, if you're kind of half getting it, he's kind of giving you an extra little nudge. Just as now the holy people do not enter you in holy array, so I swear to you that I myself will not enter above until your inhabitants enter you below. So this is again is a super interesting line here. So this is the situation. God has fallen into this realm. He's fallen inside himself and become these 8 billion little beings. And as one of these little beings, you've got this concept, you've been given this concept of heaven, of the heaven above. And you might be thinking, well, why don't you come down? God's living up in heaven. Why doesn't he come down and save me? Why doesn't he come down and bring me back up? But God can't come down and bring you back up because actually he has fallen. So, instead of saying this, which would be a bit of a downer, if you're just living down here as imagining yourself to be this limited little being, to be told that there is no heaven and there isn't a God living in it, that would be a bit of a neg. So instead of doing that, he's kind of making it like a good thing, like a kind of pact with this sentence. Just as now the holy people do not enter you in holy array, so I swear to you, that I myself will not enter above until your inhabitants enter you below. So, it's just saying, I'm not going to come down and save you. You've got to pull yourself up. You've got to pull yourself up. Next little bit. This is your consolation. I compare this wrong to you completely. But now that you are here, your ruin is vast as the ocean. He's in lament. This collapse is happening. You're ruined, but he's saying it's actually I am in lament. And he can't say that anymore because he's becoming the billion little me's. Yet if you say you cannot endure or be healed, then who will heal you really? So here we have another pointing, basically, who will heal you? So it's saying, it's not asking a question, who's going to heal you? It's saying the word, who will heal you? And then he's saying, really? Really, that will heal you. Really, it might sound mad, but really it will heal you. So, and just to reinforce that, he says, that concealed high rung in which all exists will heal you and raise you up. So, it's if you can get back, if you can travel this journey back, then you will become healed. So, I think, that's as far as we're going to go today. But as really, I think, whatever kind of mystical or spiritual pursuit you're engaged in, this is super, super interesting. Super, super interesting, and it's really saying, God has fallen. It sounds a bit heretical, but when man fell in the fall, it was really God falling and becoming these individual little men and women, this limited sense of self. So nothing physical is changing. The people are still existing, but previously they're existing in this ego-free state. And now they've descended. And in a sense, just purely on a kind of infant psychological level, traditional psychology, when you are born as a kind of point of awareness, experiencing this wondrous world. And then, your brain develops a bit more, you get a name and you learn how to interact. And because as newborns, we're very needy, you need to forge relationships. So you need to play the game, and then from there, this point of awareness slowly becomes a me. It slowly becomes a me and an increasingly complex me. So you can also read it a bit like that. Now, what this also kind of feeds into is Lurianic Kabbalah. Lurianic Kabbalah, the reading that I'm giving you here. And Isaac Luria, he basically was a Kabbalist guy from, I think, the 15th or 16th centuries. also known as the Ari. I think it means lion. I think. Anyway, he created this concept that there were the Sheviot HaKelim, I think it was called, that there were these divine vessels. So this is like the pre-fall state. These divine vessels holding incredible divine energy, pulsating away, absolutely perfect and beautiful. And then somehow they became overcharged or something like this, and they started to break open, and the light sparks that were held within them, fell down into the tohu, down into the chaotic tohu. And then the role of the the Messiah, is to go and gather these lost light sparks up and bring them back. It's sometimes they call it tikkun, repairing the face of God. So this is a very beautiful, deep analogy, and I think a proper Jewish scholar can tell you, but I think Luria got this. This was his interpretation of Zohar. He got this concept from there, this idea that we are the lost light sparks, lost in the tohu. Because of course, you can easily think of yourself, well, I'm just me, I'm just Devraj, I'm doing my thing, going through my life and doing my stuff and whatever. But if I think of myself as just a little light spark lost in the tohu, then maybe it helps me to raise myself up. And this raising up is this traveling the inner ladder, slowly dissolving the selfhood, traveling the inner ladder back. So just to sum up what we've been through today, we looked at Pardes and the importance of understanding these 4 layers. We looked at the idea of the ladder, Jacob's ladder, which is a ladder inside, gives you the capacity to move from a different concept of self, from its very hardened intellectual self, to go backwards into a kind of diffuse self. And then in this part of the text that we've been looking at, it's a kind of analogy for the concept of the fall. And this idea that God has actually fallen, and not so much fallen from some kind of idea of heaven, where he's still living, but God has actually fallen from, at the back, the top of the ladder to the front, basically. And he's become broken up into these 8 billion little me's, each with an individual concept of self. And then some of these ideas, along with like Lurianic Kabbalah and stuff, they're kind of stories, stories to help you start to make the journey back, which is the real core of mysticism, to make the journey back. So as a final point, this really does, I think, bring home the difference between the kind of exoteric understanding of like a God living up in heaven, watching over us, and the esoteric understanding, which is God has fallen too. God also has fallen, and this explains why. As I showed you earlier, this idea of the Pardes, the idea before rabbis thought they're going to go and visit God, but that it's actually not like that. They're descending into the mystical layer, not to visit God, but to actually re-establish God. And, this gives you, I think, a better idea of the kind of task at hand if you're more on the esoteric rather than the exoteric side. Because, in my own mind, if I think about going to visit God, that's one thing. If I think about going to re-establish God, that feels like a much tougher enterprise. So we're really seeing here, the difference between the traditional exoteric kind of understanding of things and the actual esoteric, the real task at hand for the mystic. Okay, cool. Thank you for sticking with me. I didn't intend to make quite such a long video today. I hope you found it useful and maybe thought-provoking, and I'll see you again soon with some more mysticism in the body. Bye for now.